That being said, I would love to invite up Taylor to talk about Laravel lessons learned.
All right. Thanks for having me. So this is Laravel lessons learned. Has anyone ever used Laravel? Wow, quite a few people actually. Cool. All right, so real quick, thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to Eli and everyone for having me. Go check out the sponsors out in the main area, chat with them a little bit. A little bit of history about me. I've been developing PHP for 6 or 7 years now. Back in like 2010, I guess, is when I got started. Before that, I did this. Does anyone know what this is? This is COBOL. It's a really exciting language, up and coming. I worked on .NET and COBOL for about 3 years right after I graduated from college. I literally worked on programs that were written before I was born. This little section right here, this revision trail, this is like what you would think of as like their git commit messages. They keep a date right here, usually at the top of these COBOL programs, and the program that I worked on had a year of 1978. I was born in 86, so it had been around for several years before I was born. So anyway, I worked on that for a few years. I did CICS, COBOL, Classic ASP, WinForms, ASP.NET, lots of Microsoft stuff. But I wanted to do some open source stuff, and PHP is a little bit easier to do on the side than .NET, I guess. It's easier to host. You can just kind of throw it up on a server. It's free, stuff like that. This is how I got my start in open source. You can see open source made me lose my hair a few years in. But the first thing I actually wrote open source was a dependency injection container for CodeIgniter. Like no one used this library. I would be surprised if anyone ever used this besides me. It was on Google Code. I wasn't even cool enough to use GitHub. So, but the interesting thing about this is this is actually still the container code that's in Laravel 5, basically. It's PSR2 now, and a few things have changed, but the basis of it is still the same. So how did I get started with Laravel? So this was me like 5 years ago, just happily programming, and I had like side business ideas that I wanted to start, and I needed a quick way to bootstrap them. So I had used CodeIgniter a little bit, and I thought it was like the greatest thing I'd ever seen in PHP. It's the only other PHP framework I've ever used to this day, besides Laravel. And this is me. I was young and naive, and I didn't know like it was a bad thing to write your own PHP framework because I had never been to a PHP conference. I had never been to a PHP user group and heard people say like don't reinvent the wheel or roll your own thing. So I just kind of did what you're not supposed to do and wrote my own framework. And like a few months into the whole process, I thought that maybe I had something like worth documenting and putting out like for the world to use. And then a few months after that, I thought maybe I had something I should like really try to document and really make a nice website and try to actually make a go of having like a serious open source project. Sorry about that. And now Laravel's actually gained quite a bit of traction, pretty popular on GitHub and quite a few users. Bigger companies have started using it. And I want to kind of talk about some lessons I learned building Laravel, and it's kind of a mix of things because there's so many lessons you learn doing open source, but I'm just kind of hitting some high-level things on why do I think that Laravel gained traction, what did I learn from the whole experience, and maybe like what can you apply to your own projects or your own applications or your business or whatever. So I'll talk about a few lessons about code, a few lessons about community, and hopefully it's helpful to you. So to start with code, first I should start to say like your mileage may vary with all this. These are all like my opinions on an already opinioned piece of software, which is Laravel. So yeah, your mileage may vary in applying any of these things, but hopefully they're helpful. The first one is superpower syntax, and this is something that I think can be really helpful for open source projects. And what I mean is you want to give your users superpowers and help them do amazing things. And this sounds like really obvious, but a lot of times people get really caught up in, I'll write this library and I'll use all the best practices and conventions and PSR 16 and everything will be perfect and right and people will use my project. And that's not necessarily the case if your project is hard to use or hard to interact with. So a project doesn't really exist to be like awesome in and of itself, right? Like to just let everyone bask in the glory of my open source project. You want to exist to make your users awesome and to help them do awesome things. So you have to kind of turn your focus outward to the community and to your users and say, how am I going to help people build great stuff easier than they could before? That's kind of always what I'm thinking with Laravel, is how can we make people's lives easier? So yeah, just making that change in your marketing can have a big difference, I think, because a lot of projects like to focus kind of internally on what they're doing in terms of best practices instead of what they can do for you. All right, so let's just take an example to illustrate this. So when you're building a web application, there's lots of common things you have to do for every project. Nowadays, a really common one is, I want to take some Sass and I want you to give me CSS, or I want you to take some less and give me CSS, or I want you to take ECMAScript 6 and give me JavaScript. And this is kind of a weird one because it's like, I want you to take this good JavaScript and give me worse JavaScript that the browsers can run. But this is what we're doing because we are just programming, and not much stuff makes sense. So we take the good JavaScript and we get worse JavaScript that the browsers can actually run. Okay, that's all I want this thing to do for me. This is all I need to from a tool. So I log into the internet. I say, I need to compile front-end stuff. How do I use Grunt? The internet responds, we don't use Grunt anymore. We use Gulp, and Gulp's probably not even like the cool tool anymore. I think it's like Webpack. So you're thinking, okay, great. I'll use Gulp. I'm ready to start gulping. And then you end up with something like this. Gulp still gives you a lot of power, but it takes a lot of syntax to do even basic stuff. Even to turn Sass into CSS or less into CSS or Browserify for your JavaScript takes actually quite a bit of code, and it's pretty confusing. And in COBOL, there was actually this joke that there was only one COBOL program ever written, and everything else is just sort of like a clone of that original COBOL program. And I kind of have a feeling like it's the same way with Gulp. Like it's something you just copy and paste from one project to another, and you're never actually like knowing what it does. You're just kind of modifying it until it works. All right, so my reaction to this kind of stuff is like, there has to be a better way than filling up this entire file with all of this convoluted Gulp syntax. And if this is like the level of complexity you want to tolerate, like at the most basic level of the application, just compiling your CSS, what level of complexity are you going to be at when you're actually doing like the actual hard stuff? So I like to try to make a lot of this boilerplate stuff really simple, really quick, and something that's mindless. I shouldn't even have to think about how to do this kind of stuff. All right, so I had an idea for how to do that, and this is one way you can build things that people will use. You take an unopinionated thing, or a tool that's just maybe verbose, and you just slap more opinions on that tool. And people actually like this. People will actually use tools like this. You just take an unopinionated thing, give it some more of your opinions, and throw it out there. People are going to make fun of you for this. This is probably the number one thing I get made fun of online for, is a lot of people will respond, Gulp was already easy. Why would you make it easier? Developers will never learn how to use Gulp for real now. Some people on the internet will make fun of you for this, but it's probably good if you ignore that, because a lot of people will actually really like it if you will just take something and give them something with opinions. All right, so we've kind of made like a trend out of this in my PHP programming career. So I came up with Laravel Elixir, which is Gulp opinions as a service, basically. We have Laravel Homestead, which is Vagrant opinions as a service. We have Laravel Cashier, which is Stripe opinions as a service. We have Laravel Forge, which is server opinions as a service. And this is kind of what I used actually to turn Laravel into a business and let me work on it full time. Was you can sign up for Forge, you pay $10 a month, and it configures PHP servers for you with Nginx and PHP, MySQL, Postgres, whatever you want. And it even supports PHP 7. So if you haven't played with PHP 7, go do a trial on Forge at least and spin up a box and check it out. All right, so back to Elixir, or back to Gulp and Laravel Elixir. This is kind of how I start each new feature with Laravel, and I think this is a really good thing you can apply to any open source project, is you step back and you say, how do I want to interact, or how do I want to accomplish this task, and just what's my dream, what's the best possible syntax I can come up with. And don't even think about, like, is it feasible, is it technically possible, or anything, but just if the world was perfect, what would my gulp syntax look like? And this kind of approach reminds me of a quote from the book by 37 Signals, Getting Real. And they have a quote that says, "Getting real starts with the interface, the real screens that people are going to use. It begins with the customer, with what the customer actually experiences, and builds backward from there. And that lets you get the interface right before you get the software wrong." And you can apply this to software development, not just to application development. Start with how real users are going to interact with your tool. And I like to call it DDD, or dream-driven development, instead of domain-driven development. But just start from the inside, from the outside, and even if you can't hit that dream syntax that you want to hit, even a few steps back from that is still usually pretty good, or a big step up from what you had. So instead of that convoluted gulp file, this is what we came up with. This is what we wanted our front-end asset compilation to look like. I want you to turn this file of Sass into CSS, and I want you to browserify this JavaScript file. It's just like, 2 lines of real code, and that's all we need to do front-end compilation. And it's just sort of like how you would just say it, like in English. And of course, the code behind this, powering it, has a lot more code back there in npm modules or vendor or wherever that lives, but whatever happens like in vendor stays in vendor. Like, I'm not concerned about that. But this is what the users actually see and how they interact with it. And it's really nice. It's easy to document, it's easy to pitch, it's easy to sell to people as a tool that can give them superpowers. So yeah, the focus is on the user. It's great for them. It helps them get productive. And think about your code as user experience, right? Kind of like the quote said from 37 Signals. Your code, or your API to your library, is your UI. Even though you don't have graphics necessarily, you still have a user experience and a user interface that you're putting on your application or your open source code. So be really, really focused on the UI that you're putting out there. All right, so that's superpower syntax. What's also great about this is it lets people try technologies they wouldn't have tried previously, and this is really cool because I have people either tweet me or come up to me in person and say, I was scared to get into Node and NPM and front-end compilation, but Elixir helps me get over the hump because it was so easy to get started. And what's cool about that is they get started with something really easy, and they will actually keep exploring that ecosystem and start playing with other tools in the ecosystem. And before you know it, they actually know quite a bit about NPM and Node and all of that stuff, just because you were able to make one thing a little easier for them to kind of get them over the hump of something they were scared to jump into. All right, so another lesson that I've learned from Laravel is you want to travel light with your code. And by traveling light, I mean like literally typing less code into your applications and trying to solve your problems with as little code as possible, or as few parts necessary to get the job done. So this is actual Laravel cashier code. You can say, I want to return invoice download, and what this does with a whole lot of magic is it renders a view template and captures a PDF of that invoice using Phantom.js, and then creates a Symfony HTTP response to download that PDF back to the browser. So in your route or your controller, this is actually all the code you have to download an invoice PDF for your users. And this is kind of another example of that superpower syntax thing where you just have that one line of code that gets you a lot of functionality that otherwise is actually pretty complicated to implement. All right, so inevitably the first response to something like this is, do you even SRP? Do you even know about the single responsibility principle? Should we really have one line that's calling Phantom.js, generating a PDF, sending a response back to the browser? And that kind of brings us to the most usual purpose of code online, it seems like, is not code as user experience, but code as thing people argue about. So anytime you put code out there, it's going to be criticized for various reasons. And so then you're going to end up with something like this, What if we made this a little bit more pro, a little bit more enterprise? We have an invoice PDF generator, a phantom JS renderer, maybe a new file system instance, a storage path. Then we can call generate PDF on the generator and then pass that to our PDF response factory and get the PDF response. So who wants to call invoice download when you can do all of this pro stuff? Like, the invoice download is boring. You want to do pro stuff with more objects and more abstraction and stuff like that. But you'll actually get this even criticized. So if you have this in your controller, now it's like you're newing up stuff in your controller method. Like, have you ever heard of dependency injection? This is like untestable, bro. Like, you got to fix all of this stuff. And if there's one thing I've learned from like the PHP internet hive mind, is that like controllers should do nothing. Like, those things exist in like this ethereal plane where they're just like this hazy fog that does nothing and passes off stuff to some domain abstraction service layer. All right, so then you go even more pro. Now you're injecting stuff. You have value objects, you have command buses, you have PDF response factories, and this is much better than just doing invoice download. You know, best practices, TM. And so then you end up kind of like, this is fine. My code's looking good. It's a lot more pro than it used to be. By the way, this comic, I'd never seen like the full version of this comic, but the dog actually dies like a pretty gruesome death at the end of this comic. I had just seen like the top two, but the dog actually melts and dies. All right, so do you like working on other people's code? Just raise your hand if you just love diving into like 50 classes written by someone else. You know, just like really starts your day good. If you don't like that, then we have to stop writing so much of our own code. Like, stop writing, 10 layers of indirection and abstraction where you could just write one line. The other people working on your project will be thankful for that. And it's really good for open source projects too, because for various reasons, which we'll get into in a second. Okay, so what's the ideal lines of code? Well, ideally, I would just write 0 lines of code, because code gets old and yucky and has bugs and stuff, but really you want to try to write as few as possible to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And it's not like we're trying to play like code golf, right? We're not trying to be like, write like this big one-liner just to have the fewest lines of code, but you want to try to solve it in just the fewest, simplest lines you can use to solve the problem. This is actually Kent Beck's 4th rule of design, which I found it useful to quote Kent Beck, because I've learned on the internet that if you quote Kent Beck, like, people are less prone to argue with you, because you're not supposed to argue with Kent Beck or like Martin Fowler and stuff. So if you're ever having a code argument, it's good if you can like shift their views to be in line with your own, and people don't like to argue with that. Anyway, his other four rules, by the way, are: it passes the test, it reveals intention, no duplication, and fewest elements. So the reveals intention part is what I mean by, you're not trying to get to one line just to get to one line. You still have to be readable. All right, so as a side note, how do you do that? How do you keep your code minimal and clean like that? And one way you could do that is just always be shipping stuff. And this is called continuous delivery, and I mean like literally force yourself to ship code by a certain date. So you say, by November 30th or whatever, we're going to ship the first version of whatever to our customers, and we're going to try to provide them with some value. And it might not be the full value you're eventually going to provide, but it's at least something they can get started with. And if you do this, you literally don't have time to like over-engineer the whole thing, because you have to ship something by a certain day. So you can only write the code that the minimal amount of code that you can to provide some value. All right, so say you're building like a wingsuit, and stock photography is actually really expensive, I noticed, so I had to draw this by hand, because it was like $30 per picture on stockphotography.com or whatever. So you iterate the first time, right? You give them like the wing part, and there's some value here that you can iterate on, and then on the next iteration you can like strap some rockets to it, and it lets you figure out flaws in your design early because you're giving them something fast. So if they come back and say like the wingsuit's uncomfortable because of this, you haven't already like welded the rocket booster onto something that you can't change now, because you're making these small iterative deployments or deliverables, and you're not trying to predict a bunch of stuff up front, which is what a lot of people try to do when they kind of over-architect the whole code base. Anyway, so that's iterating 101. How does this relate to Laravel? Laravel, sort of one of its big selling points is that it has short, memorable syntax that packs a punch, code that lets you travel light. All right, some examples. The invoice download, which we already talked about. There's no render interfaces. There's really no options or even configuration. You just download the invoice. That's all you do. That's the only method you call. And it saves a ton of time. The validation is actually really simple. You just give it an HTTP request, you give it an array of rules, and you can say really like common use cases, like verify that this email is unique in the users table. This is for like a user registration. Or verify that this name is only up to 255 characters. So it's a really simple approach. There's no like form classes or annotations or any kind of extra constructs needed to do this validation. It's just really easy. Or the ORM. There's no like metadata cache or proxy objects or whatever. You just have a Fluent query builder. You can eager load some relations in, and it gives you the PHP objects. And that's all there is to it. It's really straightforward. All right, and so then what about unit testing? This is actually really useful in Laravel. Is you can make unit testing a lot easier, and people actually unit test more. So we actually wrote some unit testing helpers, so I can say I'm expecting these events to be fired when I make this post request, and then I want to see this record in the database. So this is a really easy way, like I said earlier, about getting people to jump into something new that they're scared to jump into. If you can make it a little bit more approachable and put some helpers behind it, more people are prone to try something they wouldn't have before. All right, so a common rebuttal to this kind of approach is, what if I need to change my code? Shouldn't I be writing framework decoupled code behind interfaces and be preparing for when I switch from one framework to another? And there's actually a really easy answer to this. If you need to change your code, you open your editor, you select the text that you want to change, and you just hit your delete button on the keyboard and you change it, because if you're writing like very minimal amounts of code, it's really easy to change the code because you haven't written like 10 layers of abstraction in preparation for the future or whatever. All right, and everything will be much better than you think. So when you're building code, you don't want to try to build this. A lot of people want to try to future-proof everything from the beginning and like make it very hard to kill, the code that lasts forever basically. And you don't really necessarily need your code to be like that if your code is more like Kenny. Kenny is like disposable. He dies in every episode. He's very replaceable. It's easy to kill. It's easy to delete. Making your code like Kenny instead of trying to make it like the Terminator can actually be really useful, even though it sounds kind of counterintuitive. Make your code easily disposable. Have no problem changing it. All right, so traveling light's easy to change because there's literally just less code to change. My good friend Adam Wathan runs a podcast called Full Stack Radio, and he had this tweet the other day that was actually really good. It's easier to change 5 lines of coupled code than 5 layers of indirection written in anticipation of the future, because you always predict the future wrong, like it's inevitable. And it had 425 retweets, so pretty true, I guess, pretty valid. Traveling light is easy to document. This is really helpful for Laravel and any of your open source projects. If you can make your APIs really small, they're just inherently easier to document and show to people. And documentation is really king for an open source project. If there's any of the lessons I've learned in Laravel, it's that you really have to put a lot of effort into your documentation and like over document way more than you even thought you had to. Because people will actually use a technically inferior library that's well documented versus a very kind of technically superior, well architected library that doesn't have any documentation. People will always use whatever has the best documentation. And one thing you can do here is, if your user says your documentation is bad, it's bad. Like, you don't want to argue with the user that, no, our documentation is good, you're wrong in saying that it's bad. Like, that's a really stupid thing to do. And it's really tempting to want to do that. I've fallen into that trap many times. But anytime you write documentation, no matter how good I ever get the Laravel documentation, someone always comes along and says, this is still hard to understand. Like, you have to way over document. So some projects I've seen with actually really good documentation is Postgres, the database. Go check out their documentation. It's like super thorough, well done documentation. All right, and traveling light is easy to remember. When you can just keep a lot of syntax in your head for your library, it's actually really nice and convenient because you're not always having to go back to the documentation. And traveling light is just easier to sell. Like, it's easier for me to sell invoice download than it is for me to sell 5 or 6 layers of indirection to let you download an invoice. And that's really hard for people to accept, I think, but it's just, in terms of marketing an open source project, you have to think about that kind of thing. It's kind of like yucky and grimy as it feels. All right, so it's just very easy to sell this versus selling this. That's just how it works. So when you're doing open source, switching to a new topic, how do you decide what to build? And this is a really important thing, obviously, because you don't want to build something that no one else is ever going to use. So these are just, or this is just one lesson I've learned to determine what are you actually going to build. First, you can just build anything. Basically, anything is already going to put you ahead of 99% of people that never release anything. So that's actually really commendable. Like, anytime I see someone release an open source project, I always get really bummed when like the first comment on Reddit is like, "How is this better than this?" or whatever, because it's just like, I really salute anyone that like puts their code out there, because it's such like a kind of a vulnerable thing to do, to put your code out there to be like criticized and picked apart. So congratulations if you've ever released an open source project, because that's really great. But one good way you can decide what to build is just to scratch your own itch. And this is what I've kind of made a hobby of doing for fun and profit, is if you have something that sucks in your daily life, or in your development life, think about how to make it better. Like the same way that we did with the gulp stuff. Our gulp file was really gnarly, and we felt like it could be a lot better. So we kind of scratched our own itch, came out with Elixir, and a lot of people thought it was pretty cool. And you can do the same thing in whatever you're in. And it's really nice because a lot of times you'll be in like a niche where you see certain problems that only you can see, and you can solve those problems because you know about the business domain or whatever. And a lot of people do really well with that. All right, so, and I should note that you don't have to be smart or a genius to be successful at this. Like, don't be intimidated that you don't know like all the best techniques or all the right ways to solve a problem. Don't let that hold you back from jumping in and trying to do something. For example, I log back into the Slack channel for our company. My coworker says our development environment is really crappy. This was like 2 years ago. This is a real story. And we were both using, or we had switched back and forth. Sometimes we were using VirtualBox, sometimes we were using MAMP, and sometimes we were using Vagrant, and we just couldn't like get a system that felt really good for us. And so I said, I have this 300-line bash script that I use to configure my VirtualBox. Maybe we can like run that, package the VirtualBox up in Vagrant, and ship that as like a pre-configured box. Now, if you put this idea like out on Hacker News or out on Reddit, they're probably going to say this is a really stupid idea. You should be using like Puppet or Salt or Ansible or something really more advanced to do this kind of thing. But you don't always have to do that to have a successful project. So we packaged up that box and we shipped it as this thing called Laravel Homestead. And there's nothing advanced about it. It's like the simplest thing we've ever done, really. It's just one big bash script that's like 300 lines long. You can go look at it on GitHub. But it's really, really freaking convenient. And it gives you everything you need to get started. PHP, Nginx, MySQL, Redis, Memcached. And Rasmus actually forked this box to do his PHP 7 development box that people use to certain features. To say like this doesn't really, we're going to hold off on adding this feature for now, and we'll maybe consider it later. But don't be scared to say no. So an illustration of this is a lot of times users want to jump the gun, and they want to give you an implementation when for a problem they want. So let's talk about the front end thing again. When we were talking about like how should we handle front end stuff with Laravel, a lot of users are saying, I want a PHP asset pipeline. That was what we kept hearing. That's what I kept hearing, like at user groups or on Twitter. Okay, so you don't really want a PHP asset pipeline. You just, your Sass and your CoffeeScript or your ECMAScript or whatever. So try to get behind like what the users are asking you for. And this is kind of a philosophy called jobs to be done. Many users want to keep their grass short. So one answer to that is, you come up with better like lawnmowers. Well, if you kind of like think of the root of the problem, like I want my yard to always be nice and beautiful. People that think like behind the problem, like maybe they invent like a grass seed that like is genetically engineered to never grow or something like that, so you never have to mow it. So you have to kind of like try to get behind what your users are asking you for. And this is actually really nice because when we came out with Elixir, it's just a lot less magical than trying to write a PHP asset pipeline. One, there's no one maintaining a browser of files. Just kind of, I'll use your stuff if you add this, or if you add this, or if you add that. Listen to them, but tread carefully. All right, so about the haters. Let the haters energize you instead of depress you. And when I say haters, I don't mean skeptics. Like there's a difference between skeptics and haters. Skeptics are not like mean and demoralizing to you. They just are not believers in your approach or whatever. That doesn't mean they're haters. So dealing with haters is really hard, so probably just ignore them. But acknowledge what the haters are saying might be true. Like, maybe Laravel does suck. Okay, then what am I going to do about that? Like, the only thing I can do is just try to make it better and just let that energize me to keep working on the project. So it's really good if you have kind of like a support network of friends that you can vent to like privately about things that tick you off or whatever. But try not to let the haters depress you. Try to let them energize you into making your project. You have to like not listen to people that are going to never use your product. So if people are like really like blasting you and like they're just being mean and they're never really ever going to be interested in anything you do, no matter how much you improve it, like it's just not worth your time. Just move on. All right, so related to haters, you want to make your community passionate and positive. This is extremely valuable because being positive just scales a lot better than being negative. So you can attract a following being negative. Like you can actually build, will come and be a part of that. But you can actually gain weight. On negative like in a funny way, but I mean like genuinely being like mean and hateful. That doesn't scale as well as just being. This is the really great thing, and what's benefited Laravel so much in my experience is when people are excited and positive about your project, they do things like make pull requests, they tell their friends, they write blogs, or they start entire businesses, devoted to making video tutorials about effects. So if you get people, you're positive, you're trying to make people's lives better, people are going to create even more momentum and more blogs and more pull requests and Laravel community is we've had people that like Jeffrey Way that started Laracast, and he was the first person to really go. I don't know where we would be without him, but I'm so thankful that. All right, so to recap briefly, focus on giving your users super. Like impress yourself or your friends or whatever. Try to make your users better. Try to give them superpowers. Try to make what they're doing like solutions to problems, like the Laravel Elixir solution or the Homestead solution. You don't necessarily to benefit your users. Scratch your own itches. If you have something that you think sucks, try to make it better. Friendly towards people, try to have a positive that feedback loop. All right, so that's sort of a few lessons learned from Laravel. I've got about 5 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, there is a mic up here, and I'll be glad to try to answer anything about my experiences in open source. Thanks.
What would you say the PHP community could learn from Laravel community to be better specifically as a community? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how does the Laravel community work, and what could the PHP community learn from the Laravel community? I don't know if anything really jumps out that I would say the PHP community could learn. I think the PHP community is pretty cool. The one thing I would say, I guess, is like it's okay if people are different than you or have different values than you. So like one thing I sometimes see in the PHP community is Fig or Composer or whatever as quickly as you think they should. And it's sort of this weird way of saying you're not communitying the way I think you should be communitying, which is a really like anti-community thing to say. Just kind of try to accept people where they're at and say like it's okay if you don't value the things that I value. Like if you try to put your value systems, whether that's I think you should adopt these practices or I think you should think these things are important, trying to force those value systems on another part of the community is like anti-community. That's not community, but a lot of people tend to think that means you're communitying, as if you're saying assimilate into what I view as being a good community citizen. So anyway, that's just off the cuff what I think is just try to be like cool with people where they're at instead of trying to force them to be like how you think they should be. Just like high five, they're doing good stuff, and they're still a part of the community. Anyway, hope that was okay.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. Run on up.
Wondered how. Wow. Okay. I've always wondered how the Laravel organization works in terms of how it's structured. Is there any kind of leadership? How are people promoted or brought in? Do people just join out of nowhere? Like, how does all that work?
Yeah. So, how does the Laravel community work in terms of structure? There's actually not a lot of structure. I'm basically the only one that merges stuff into in the Laravel Slack channel. We have a Slack channel. And then within that Slack channel, we have like an internals channel for talking about actually developing the framework, and anyone can join that and talk or throw. Advertise this Slack channel. I'm in there from 8 to 5, and anyone can come in and talk about building the framework. And really, anyone's voice is welcome to throw out an idea or to say that something could be better, or there is sort of like a contingency plan, like a bus factor contingency plan, where if I were to be hit by a bus or whatever, which you actually hear about this a lot when you become an open source programmer, is your own death. But if you were to be hit by a bus, there actually is a plan to like pass on what is Laravel and all of its related ecosystem to Jeffrey Way. So we actually do have like emergency plans, but in terms of like day-to-day as big as something like Drupal or Joomla, you know what I mean? Like of structure yet. So that's just kind of how we do it now.
All right, well, thank you very much, Taylor. Round of applause if you would. All right, everyone. The next session starts at 3, and I'll see everyone at the Drupal release party at 5:30.